this kind of baseline of discussion we've had so far is really going to how important these provisions really are, even though, at least for me as an outsider, it feels it's the model, you don't have much say in it. You have to take what you get. But that's not the right answer if you have clients and you have a company, you're trying to manage risks. We have to push and know where to push and know how to advise our clients on the risks if we can't get the provisions we want. Laura, could you walk us through why drafting these governance provisions for the AI model is harder sometimes than drafting specific governance provisions for the vendor's part of their product? So what makes it particularly difficult?
Sure. I'll cover a few different points, but I'll start with I think, Laura, every time I've talked to you and Matt about AI and contracting, I think we tend to start with the same framework of thinking about when we're talking about AI drafting. Sure, many of us have our contracts directly with the Anthropics and the OpenAIs and those model providers. And so we do have contracts directly with those frontier models. But what's coming up more for us and where we probably have more ability to have a back and forth when it comes to contracting is all of those vendors who are building tools that incorporate or are based off of those third party model providers. So, one of the real tensions when we're thinking about these model provisions that we're talking about today is we have to recognize that it's not just necessarily us as a customer and a vendor of a platform, so say our HR platform, but there's also the third party model provider. So when we're talking about what we want to see, both as a vendor and a customer, while we may be willing to give a little bit more, we're really confined by what that relationship is with the third party model provider and that vendor who's incorporating their model. So vendors have to be very careful that they're not promising to give a certain level of information and transparency to their customers that they don't have from the underlying model provider. And as customers, we have to recognize that our vendors do have certain of those limitations. So that I always like to think of the starting framework, just because whatever beautiful language we may even be able to get or our vendors would want to provide, there are slowdown limitations that we have to consider. Another thing when we're talking about these models is they do feel like a black box to all of us. I know there's starting to be more pushes with transparency, and there's also the regulations are saying there has to be a certain level of transparency when we're talking about the models being used in certain high risk use cases. But we also have to think about this kind of moat of the model is, and a lot of the model is going to be proprietary. So for the provider of the model, it's their training data set, and even what they were using for that set. That could be considered something that they're not going to give you visibility into. The weighting that is going into how their algorithms are working. And then even if you're that vendor who has the third party, so you're not one of these big LLMs, you might be building off of that. You're fine tuning the model, right? You're doing different things to make it work in your use case. And a lot of that is going to be proprietary. So that's also a concern that we're not just talking about, okay, it's like the code as proprietary. There's so much that goes around the deployment of the model that could be
Yeah.
considered proprietary. And I guess as just maybe the third starting point, I will say is we talk about this is very different. AI is very different than typical software that we have seen, which is static, right? Your code is written and your software is going to execute that code. AI is by its nature dynamic. That means like models are retrained. So there's more data that's added and the model is retrained. There's different fine tuning. There's parties that are swapping out models, right? We're seeing a lot of these providers, new versions of models that are coming out. We're seeing certain models maybe excelling in areas and not. So unlike a lot of the software that we're used to, where you're like, okay, it's set, you set it and forget it. We know about it and it's not going to change. There is going to be change to the underlying model provider. So those provisions that we have that are tending to focus on, I have this one-time source of knowledge, those aren't going to be the source of truth throughout the entire time they're using one of these tools because the software itself and the tool is dynamic.
That's a great overview. Thank you. I typically have one of the speakers act as the vendor and try and share that perspective. So Matt is going to be our vendor for today. And so my first question for you, Matt, is really looking at these provisions from that vendor perspective. What do you see as the core tension vendors have when they're negotiating these AI model governance provisions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Here's a couple of core tensions, and I think you both touch on like broad obligations, but also very specific requirements and requests for information. So starting with the broad obligations, right? A cooperation obligation that may not have any end in sight or a defined time limit, right? Including even after, let's say, an agreement ends or terminates. And so you're going to have your team of engineers that with limited resources, they can't necessarily be fielding constant requests for information or just spending resources on that. Also, like really not laying out particularly the costs of providing professional services, right? You don't want your people, if you're a vendor, bogged down in dealing with a lot of these issues. And so where the client may have questions or you need information to respond to a regulatory inquiry, or if there's an incident, right? You want to really cabin those in a way that is both agreeable to you, but also gets the customer what they need so they're not violating any statutes or regulations. And I think on the specific side, right? I mean, from the vendor, you don't want to have a customer who's going to overreach as for the moon and the stars. And in addition to the proprietary information that you can't provide because it's your trade secret or you have some contractual constraint, you may not have certain documents that a customer is asking for, right? And so I think you've really got to be reasonable, whatever, we're going to talk about that word a bunch today, but or thoughtful maybe is a better approach, right? To provide the information that allays the customer's concerns, that will give them information about, here's a model card, right? So we know what the model is, what version it is, it identifies known risks and known limitations. Because as Laura mentioned, you can't know every single potential issue with the AI, right? But if there's things that you have tested, model drift testing, bias audits, and you can really talk about things in terms of like categories, right? Really just do it in a way that is useful to the customer and get them to understand, like, look, I don't have all this stuff. I can't give it to you for these reasons. And really, what are your concerns? And I'll meet you where you are to get you the information that you need. I think vendors do have flexibility, right? Because I think the reality is that models are being updated. And so vendors do have flexibility in providing testing information, notice of updates, and really thinking about it. Look, what the model is today is not likely to be what the model is from 6 months from now. So you don't want to be locked into anything to a specific model or any obligation where you just have ongoing, unclear costs that don't have any specific time frame on.
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about these things from, if you put yourself as somebody maybe who's a customer, put yourself in the shoes of the vendor and you're like, oh, they do have it hard. So I appreciate that. And actually, I'm all for and think we should start a campaign to replace reasonable with thoughtful in all our contracts. It's a lot more sense and makes me feel more comfortable, I think. So Laura, looking at it now from the customer side, what do you think are the things that are missing or that vendors are leaving out of these provisions that customers really need and should push for?
Yeah, I'll start with a framework that I apply when it comes to thinking about this sort of contract, but then also other ones as well. And that's really looking at this in terms of what do I care about from a very practical perspective. So sometimes, right, when we get into negotiations, we dig in and I'm like, I want full transparency. I want to know all of the things. I actually don't want to know all of the things about a model. If I am working with a vendor, I also think that I should be okay with saying, you know what, the vendor who is building this tool knows best. This is their product. So they should know which model that they want to be deploying for what use case. They should be building the product for that. I am going to them because I don't want to make those decisions. I don't want to know what I should use for deep research or reasoning or all of that. And I honestly, like, the model cards are great, but also we have to be practical and think, even if we were to get all of this information from our vendors, what are we looking at it for? Like, why do we care about a lot of this stuff? And when we're talking about models, I think a lot of the questions from the customer side comes down to really what's going on with our data from a security perspective. I think when we're saying what does the customer really want when it comes to a contract, it's very fair that a contract itself is not going to be incredibly prescriptive about the model that's being used, right? The vendor doesn't want to lock into a model. I, as a customer, don't want to lock into a particular model. But what I want to do is make clear that certain kind of performance thresholds are being met, that the model is going to do all of the things that you're telling me it's going to do with AI. That's also what is the accuracy rate of that. So I think it's really important that the contract have some of those high level statements that you separately have, not in the contract, but a very clear understanding of what third party models are being used. And that's partly on your sub processor list. But what is the model that's being used? I want to understand, and I need you to commit that the model's not training on my data. I want you to commit to the data retention policies that are happening with that, those sort of things. And if you change a model, you're not going to come and get my approval to change a model. But I, especially as a customer, need to know if there is any change to the underlying model or the provider when it's like materially changing what those guarantees are. If you told me you're not training on my data and you switch to a model where now they are training on my data, or you told me there's zero data retention and now it's a different retention policy. If I was using a model and have come to expect a certain SLA with a performance metric, and that has dropped significantly, materially, which we would define, those are the sort of things that I need to know. So we need to make sure that the contract is having those buckets. We separately understand what all of those systems are that are underlying it, so we can do some of that validation on our own. So that's like from the model itself. I'll also say, going back to reasonable and thoughtfulness, like we really do need, again, we said there's a certain black box, but this is why cooperation is so important, that even if we can't understand certain of these proprietary algorithms that are going on, we need to make sure that our vendor is willing to work with us if there are problems that arise. Because again, this is dynamic and things are changing and things break and models drift. And that's why it's even more important that cooperation is really well laid out, right? Like that there's a mechanism in the contract that if we're starting to get results that are not what we expected, we have somebody to go to that's not just like support at and going to one of their chatbots, right? We have a point of contact we can reach out to, we can go to for those important decisions. And that's like just your typical, sure, we'll reach out and we'll try to help, it really doesn't suffice here.
Yeah. And all fantastic points. And all of this kind of baseline of discussion we've had so far is really going to how important these provisions really are, even though at least for me as an outsider, it feels it's the model. You don't have much say in it. You have to take what you get. But that's not the right answer if you have clients and you have a company, you're trying to manage risks. We have to push and know where to push and know how to advise our clients on the risks if we can't get the provisions we want.